Welcome. So, this is the second of our lessons on medieval church history, continuing the series Christ Church Through the Ages, lesson 39 in the total series, and of course, following on from part 1 last week, this is part 2 on the short little foray that we're doing on the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Last week we covered some of the earlier details, some of the background, the pretext to many of these things. And what I explained last week was that this week we were wanting to focus on some of the contemporary quotations, historical sources that we have from that 5th century, that climactic, apocalyptic 5th century in Roman history, from, of course, the bastions of almost anything that was written really during that time, which were various of the church leaders, a number of the bishops or the theologians during that time. A theme which will become quite apparent as we transition into what we definitively categorize as the beginning of the early Middle Ages. But part 2 here is going to be focused, as you can see on your notes before you, kind of select quotations about or concerning the fall of the empire on the whole, but particularly centered around the 2 major sackings of Rome. Of course, the one that we focused on last week, the sack of Rome, as it's often simply known, in 410 at the hands of the Visigoths, at the hands of King Alaric of the Visigoths, as well as the subsequent sacking that happens at the hands of the other, or one of the other of the major Germanic tribes, the Vandals, King Gaiseric in 455. And what we're wanting to do for the purpose of today is get an understanding of people who lived through it, particularly, of course, as I said, Christians who are the ones who really preserved not just knowledge, but in some cases quite literally writing during the fall of the Western Empire. The very concept and practice of the written word was preserved exclusively through the churches, when it otherwise would have been destroyed and lost at the hands of illiterate Germanic barbarians, as the Romans viewed them to be. And so that purpose gives us something which we can then discuss, because part of the purpose of this little short 2-part pretext of the fall of the Western Empire is, apart from knowing the pretext of setting up the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages in particular for us, is also the kind of modern contemporary air or atmosphere of vague of allusions back to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, or the fall of the Roman Empire as most people usually know it, and angst and concern and trepidation that comes from any sense of comparison between our time and theirs, which seems all too eerily similar. The beauty or the benefit of what we're going to do today with these quotations will give us some important lessons that will inform things for us here today, but also inform our understanding for things going forward, because there's sentiments expressed by many of the clergy and the theologians during those days, which will not be the first time in this series throughout the Middle Ages that you will hear these kinds of words, right? And that'll become more apparent as to what I mean by that as we go through. So, as I said, we're going to begin with the contemporaneous works and wordings and writings around the big sack of Rome in 410 at the hands of the Visigoths, which, as I said, we in part touched on last week. The first quotation is going to come on page 2 of your notes, where you'll find most of the quotations. We covered this one last week, but it's simply to remind you, of course, of what's said, especially the most famous line, one of the most famous lines said during this time period of history, actually, from St. Jerome's 127th letter to Principi, which he wrote around 2 years after the sacking at the hands of the Visigoths. Quote, "A terrible rumour reached us from the west." Okay, so St. Jerome is living in Bethlehem during these days. He's living in Bethlehem translating scriptures into Latin, right, as was his chief work. He was the greatest translator in the early church, and one of the greatest translators in the history of the church. "Rome is besieged. The price of safety is gold. After taking away everything, the enemy rearms himself to demand more." And then, of course, that famous line which I pointed out, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Right? The eternal city, Eterna Roma, the eternal Rome, the Caput Mundi, the capital of the world, was now taken. the place that had conquered all the world, as those in the world at the time understood it, had now been conquered by those from its fringes and its borderlands in murky, misty forests, right? And, of course, then continues on, who could believe it, that Rome, built on her 7 hills, would perish by one fire, that she would become the sepulchre of her people, right, the tomb of her people, that holy places would be defiled by the lust of barbarians. That's the quote we primarily saw from last week. This city which had taken the whole world was itself taken, because as we highlighted and as we want to really get into the weeds of today, the universal view both among Christians and pagans was that this is something that was impossible, it could never happen. It has now happened, and it must mean that up is down and down is up and left is right and right is left and in is out and out is in and black is white and everything's in opposite and the world is ending. Okay. What you'll get, especially from some of the sentiment as this travails forward, especially in the next quotation, which we're going to come to just in a minute, which is one of the deeper discourses on this, apart from St. Augustine in The City of God, his magnum opus, which deals with much more than just the fall of Rome, right? But is from St. Salvian, okay? A lengthy discourse. We're just going to quote a portion of it, right? But the sentiment you will see, and it's important for you to understand, is that whilst everyone was blaming everyone else for what was happening, so Christians blaming pagans, pagans blaming Christians, everyone blaming the Germanic barbarians, there were few voices, fortunately in the position of leadership at this time, who had the wisdom and knowledge and insight and vision, one might say, to have introspection on really the root of the problems and to see not only what they were, but to see through them and to see amidst the black abyss of this time period in which people the world over were agreed this must be the end of the world, right? If Rome has been sacked, right? If Rome has been taken by heretics no less, Arians, the Visigoths, this must be the end of the world. That understanding is important for people in general to learn, okay? Because, and I'm saying this tongue-in-cheek but also trying to make a genuine point, that if you're living through a time and you think, or people think it's the end of the world, it's almost certainly not, okay? Because there has been multitudes of times on really big scales and on seemingly comparatively smaller scales, like just individual nations, or what we'd identify at least as nations today, kingdoms, where people have become convinced that it must be the end of the world, okay? Because it was the end of, to use a bit of lazy language, their world. It was the end of the world that they had grown up in. It was the end of their common understanding of their life and the life of their people as it had currently existed, right? It would be akin to the United States of America ceasing to exist, right? Given especially that the United States is by far and away the greatest and easiest comparison to ancient Rome that exists in the modern world, right? For a variety of reasons. Apart from the fact that they modelled themselves so heavily off of the Roman Republic and are also facing much of the fate that Rome then eventually faced, which was internal strife, imperial overexpansion, corruption among the elites and various other elements, and a burn and a fade out of history, right? And this sentiment of the end of the world is something which comes up over and over and over again, but it is in fact not the end of the world. And it is largely, thankfully, through the wisdom and sagacity of some of these guys in leadership that, quite frankly, they were able to guide and lead their people through a time that they thought was the end, that it was over, right? They had enough wisdom, hence why I say sagacity, right, to see through the immediate circumstance of their own demise into light at the proverbial end of the tunnel, as it were, right? But that came through, among other means, introspection. Okay, not a terribly dissimilar theme or motif to what I preached on a fortnight ago before Australia Day. Okay? Namely among them, as I said, is St. Salvian. This is from his work around AD 439. Okay, so he writes it in the decades of the aftermath of this time, and he's writing obviously not only about the sack, but he's writing about the fall of Rome, the evident fall of the empire, that is manifest before the people during these days, right? This is part of a larger discourse. This is taken from, I believe, chapter 12 of his work on the governance of God, okay? But one of the single most important things ever written during this time period in terms of gaining a contemporary insight from a historical source as to the mindset and the view of the church at the time, especially in Rome or in the West in general, right? So, quote, "If God does regard human affairs, someone may say, if he cares for us, loves and guides us, then why does he allow us to be weaker and more miserable than all nations?" Right? Because that's how they're feeling, right? We are being crushed here by all of these either pagan or heretical nations around us, right? If God cares for human affairs, if he loves us and guides us, why has he allowed us to be crushed? Why is he allowing our empire to fall? Why is he allowing the end of our world, as it were? Right? Why does he suffer us to be conquered by the barbarians? Why does he permit us to be subject to the rule of our enemies? To answer very briefly, as I have already said, so he's referring back to earlier in the text, he, referring to God, suffers us to endure these trials because we deserve to endure them. I'll say that sentence again. He suffers us to endure these trials because we deserve to endure them. Let us consider the disgraceful habits, the vices and crimes of the Roman people, as we have described them above. And we shall then understand whether we can have any claim on his protection when we live in such impurity. If we examine in this light our customary argument that our misery and weakness shows God's neglect of human affairs, because that was an argument, God has abandoned us, right? There were those in and outside the church, especially the pagans, who were making that argument, right? Your God has abandoned you. The emperors have become Christian. This new enterprise of Christianity being the religion of Rome has failed because he's abandoned us. That's the very distinctly pagan way of thinking. If we're losing in battle, our God has abandoned us. Okay, all right, and not without warrant. Okay, because there is an element of truth to that, right? But only an element. So that's what he's saying, right? If we examine this in light of our customary argument being the operative word, that our misery and weakness shows God's neglect of human affairs, abandonment, what do we really deserve? If he permitted us, living in such vice and wickedness, to be exceedingly strong, prosperous, and completely happy, then perhaps there might be some ground for suspicion that God does not see the evil doings of the Romans, if he allowed such wicked and abandoned men to be happy. So do you understand the point he's making there? What he's saying is, look at our sins. He's mentioned them elsewhere, right? All of which are true, by the way. All of which are the same things we're doing now, on various different things, socially, familially, economically, politically, so on and so forth, even religiously. If we just continue to be a strong, mighty, prosperous empire, does this not communicate that God's people can live in one degree or another, depending on who you're talking about, in all manner of sins and evils and vices, and yet be equally blessed by heaven? The answer to these rhetorical questions is obviously no. No. Since, instead, he bids such vicious and evil men to be most abject and wretched, it is perfectly evident, in other words, completely manifest, that we are seen and judged by God, for our sufferings are fully deserved. So St. Salvian, among others like St. Augustine and others during this time, are the grace of God, and they are the sages of that time that God had given to those people, to the Christians, to show the light, even though that light be very painful and uncomfortable. Because what St. Salvian is saying here, in very profound but equally clear terms, is that the reason why this was happening to the Roman people was because they deserved it. And keep in mind, he's speaking about himself, he's speaking about his people. He's not talking about some far-flung heathens across the lands of wherever. He's talking about his own people. Okay? He is talking about his own flesh and blood in his own beloved land, right? He is committed to truth and honesty to a degree that is called for by God and that is inherent to the Christian religion. And that is truth at all costs, right? Even if that truth burns us in its light, okay? St. Salvin and the others are very clearly elucidating and illuminating, literally and figuratively, the reality of their time, which is, we deserve this. This is the rightful judgment, chastisement, justice of God against our, to use his terms, vices, evil doing, etc., right? Our own wickedness, okay? If God allowed us, the Roman people, to continue to have an empire that ruled the world in prosperity and glory, whilst we continued to live and behave like this, it would communicate that our God is simply no better than the old gods of our pagan forebears, right? Who blessed us with glory and majesty amidst corruption and destruction and conquest and everything else, right? The answer is no. No, that will not be permitted and that will not continue. Because there is a dualistic nature to this, and this is why this quote is so essential. Even though St. Salvin is one of the more unheard of, comparatively speaking, late early church fathers, amidst some other real titans of his time like St. John Chrysostom, St. Jerome, St. Augustine especially, of Hippo that is that his work, this work that I'm quoting from here on the governance of God, is one of, if not maybe the clearest articulation of wisdom during this time. Right? Even just the subsection that we've referenced here. Okay? The fact that the people were Christian, he was not necessarily questioning, right? But such Christians had, as we might say in modern parlance, backslidden, right? Drifted, fallen away, right? They had fallen into sin, into cultural and habitual sin, and one person does it, and then others do it, and then this generation teaches the next generation to do it, which teaches the next generation to do it, which teaches the next generation to do it, and all of a sudden, the tiny little snowball at the top starts building and building and building and building and building as it comes down, rolling down the mountain, right? It's this snowball effect, okay? There's a reason why people feel a sense of historical echo and angst from the fall of the Roman Empire unto our time, and it is because we have done almost literally the exact same thing, just with Wi-Fi. Okay, we've done the same thing with, except it comes with, computers and fighter jets, right? Over the course of, and this is why you hear me talk about this much longer view of modern history, right? It's not like, everything was brilliant until the GFC or something, and then after 08 it all started going downhill. No, it hasn't been going downhill since 2008. It's been going downhill since at least 1908, if not 1808, right? It's been going downhill for more than 5 minutes, okay? Because things that begin as apostate, idolatrous ideas become inculcated in a handful of people. It then spreads, especially because of the way of academia and education and other such things. It gains popularity, it grows and grows and grows. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, across generation to generation to generation to generation. And you go from holistically Christian and virtuous and mighty empires like ours of the British Empire, which God saw fit to grant a quarter of the world, right, and the largest landmass that the world had ever seen, an empire upon which the sun never set, to its descendants being ruled by satanic pedophiles. Okay? Who rape children, who sacrifice them to Baal and Moloch, and control financial systems and everything else that comes with it. Okay? That's how you go from that to that. Okay? We have done the same things. And it's not just all this upper echelon level either, because notice how he's not giving some qualification. Notice how he didn't say, consider, let me find the exact specific sentence. Yes. So it's about 2/3 of the way through, or actually no, halfway through, right? Let us consider the disgraceful habits. You'll notice it there on the quote on your page. About a quarter or a third of the way through, right? Fifth line down, I should say. Fifth line down on that quote, on your page, that is. Let us consider the disgraceful habits, the vices and crimes of those darned patricians in the Senate. No. The vices and crimes of the emperors who have been thrust upon us. No. Of the Roman people. Patrician or plebeian. He's talking about it all. Right? From the richest to the poorest, the greatest to the least, he's talking about the whole group. Now, and this is the other thing too, again, genuine wisdom, and more importantly, integrity and honesty, as well as humility, by the way, that undergirds all of that, is St. Salvian himself, or did St. Salvian himself, engage in these kinds of vices and vices and evils that he lists earlier on in this work? No. There's no evidence he did. No, by all accounts, he was a virtuous, righteous church leader. But notice the collective language, the Roman people, right? The us, the we, the whatever else, especially when you read the rest of it, right? Our customary argument, our this, we that, as we have described them above, as we shall then understand, blah, blah, blah. Because he doesn't get to magically just separate himself, right? Because life doesn't work that way. Because fortunately, 17th and 18th century Enlightenment individualism had not yet been invented, right? And so this is a time where people are rooted in family, they're rooted in, or in the literal Greek sense, ethnos, right? Nations, they're people, they're countrymen, they're kin, right? They're rooted in their people. And so that he doesn't just separate himself from the Roman people. He is part of the Roman people. Is he himself personally guilty? No. But he is part of the cohort, pardon the Roman pun, that is responsible. He doesn't get to escape the judgment of God in the collective sense simply because he himself was righteous. No, he's also going to go down with the ship, right? But he does so with honour and integrity, like a captain goes down with the ship. The captain may not have caused the problem, right? Might have been some 14-year-old idiot down in the boiler room or wherever else who's blown a gasket and this and that and the ship's now sinking, whatever else, blah, blah, blah. Or it could be some lieutenant, it could be anyone, it could be someone. It's someone else is guilty for why the ship's going down, but the captain's responsible. And so the captain's got to go down with the ship with honour and integrity, right? Not as one guilty, but one who is responsible, right? And so and thank God that God had raised a number of these men. There's just a really, even amidst a very licentious, morally degraded and decadent time period, God also had then, at the same time, slotted in just a really good generation or cohort of church leaders to guide the Christian people through that whole ordeal. That's why so many of them come in this cluster. Like, I'm only mentioning some of them, but like I said earlier, St. John Chrysostom, St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, St. Jerome, St. Salvian, and many others who I'm not mentioning, right? Especially in the West. And so there's mercy in that God's not trying to destroy the church. He's actually going to do what we're about to see in the coming lessons, which is that as the flower of Rome is crushed, it's leaves, and it's like crushing a dandelion. It all just kind of blows everywhere, and Christianity explodes out from the West to far greater degree than it ever had whilst it was contained within the Western Roman Empire, right? But he identifies that they are the problem, right? Especially that last sentence, which is him repeating much of the beginning, right? Since instead he bids such vicious and evil men to be the most abject and wretched, it is, therefore, perfectly evident that we, the Roman people, are seen and judged by God. God has not abandoned us. God has not neglected us. No, he actually sees us entirely, and he is judging us for what we've done. For our sufferings are fully deserved. Even if it is chastisement brought upon people who have become overwhelmingly Christian, as the Romans did, including their emperors. Right? An extremely valuable lesson, which is why my sermon a fortnight ago, as I mentioned in the title of it, was not the Australian crisis, as if it was this large, big, national civic kind of enterprise, although of course that would, I suppose, generally apply. It was entitled The Crisis of the Australian. The person, the people, you, me, us, we, right? We are the problem. As much rampant and manifestly evident decadence, degeneration and corruption there is, on the most manifold of displays, especially these days with things like internet, among the political class, corporate class, financial class, all these enterprises and and groups kind of working in cahoots together. They are not simply there, and we, the righteous, virtuous, common man, are like standing as a bulwark against them. No. We actively support various different political parties with the very same people in them. We actively support policies and positions and practices that corporations and financial institutions and educational institutions and et cetera, all actively perpetrate, right? These institutions are not just these nameless, faceless things, although they've kind of become that in a way, at least in terms of alleged democracy. They're filled with people. They're filled with people, right? The government isn't run at any level, local, state or federal, by like a handful of a dozen or whatever it is cabinet members. No, it's run by an entire horde of government employees, hundreds of thousands. That is us, right? We are the problem, okay? I don't see churches filled to the brim, and yet you're complaining about our nation going down the toilet. We're complaining about mass migration, and rightfully so, and the utter invasion of our lands with foreign hordes, but yet more than half of the marriages end in divorce. And you're having one or two kids on top of one or two abortions. So what are we doing? Right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We could go on about this all day long. No, we are the problem. We are the problem. God has not abandoned us, we've abandoned God. And therefore, as well as I was also going to mention this earlier, this is the dualistic nation of judgment. God judges things, so there's an active judgment on things, and God also permits or allows things which are in themselves a judgment, okay? God does not judge, like we talked about often in sermons, God does not simply judge on the great day of judgment at the end of all things, right, as we say. Things throughout history, God judges throughout history, okay? Like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah or the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, right? These things are judgments. Even just the practices, the rampant immorality, the sexual licentiousness, the things I mentioned earlier, like divorce and adultery and greed and murder and corruption, whatever else, are in themselves a judgment, right? If we are going to be a people who partake and participate in greed, avariciousness, lust, adultery, murder, blah, blah, then that's exactly what our elite class will also do to us, okay? They're judgments. They will be judged, these things will be judged by God, but they are also judgments in and of themselves. This is how God operates consistently throughout Scripture, right? So it's why, in the next, just very select quotations from St. Augustine's of Hippo's De Civitatis Dei, the City of God, right? Which is his greatest work. He writes this in response to the sack of Rome in 410 to give Christians a deep, profound theological and philosophical outlook on really the history of the world and of life in general and the existence of everything, right? Comparing the city of God, the kingdom of heaven, to the city of man, as he refers to it in this kind of allegorical way, right? But he says, if Rome has perished, what can be safe, right? It's playing on those words from similar to what we saw from St. Jerome, right? And he explains one of the things I mentioned earlier as well, right? The worshippers of false gods lay the blame for these calamities on the Christian religion, right? So one of the chief, or not just one of, the chief claim among the pagan portion of the Roman people that were left was, we were pagan, we worshipped the god of our ancestors, the gods, plural, of our ancestors, Jupiter, Mars, etc., etc. We then changed that, especially among the emperors who converted to the faith, praise God. Masses of the people, there were already millions of Christians among the Romans, but even more millions of Romans became Christian from the early to mid 4th century onward in this last 100 years. But now our empire is falling, right? Seems like a plausible argument, except for the fact that the empire had already been falling. The empire had been declining and decaying since really the death of Marcus Aurelius in 181, right? Because whilst we talk about the fall of Rome as being kind of this thing in and around the 5th century AD, that's just more for historical simplicity. The empire reached its peak territorially in 117, in the end of the year of the reign of the Emperor Trajan. From that point onward, that's the height of the Roman Empire. The height of the empire is the 2nd century. And from that point onward, it is the slow and steady and then eventual significant and exponential collapse from there on out. Right? So this argument of it being the Christians' fault was one that was not steeped in history. It was steeped in the kind of false idealism that paganism still held to, which is that everything was going just great while we had these things, and then now we've changed it. The reason why I included that quote, apart from pointing out that historical element, is actually something quite interesting, because it's touching on what I've talked about quite a lot, right? I mentioned it in passing earlier, actually, in fact, right? Oh, things were great during my childhood, and then, in the 90s and the 2000s, that's when it all started really turning. When this guy became prime minister, blah, 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 right, whatever else we usually point out, and then someone else will point out some different prime minister or whatever the heck. When we were all going really great, and then the such and such party got in, and blah, 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 right? No, this has been going downhill since before any of us were born. Because we're witnessing the late stage, increasingly exponential portion of this without remembering the fact that Rome, though it eventually fell in 476, began falling in 181. Okay, 300 years of decline. Right? That's why the times of persecution that came, especially in the 3rd century, like the Decian persecution in the mid 200s, and then even worse yet, the Great Persecution, as we know it in history, the Diocletianic persecution, so the persecution basically from 303 to 313, roughly speaking, 10 years in which tens of thousands of Christians were crucified and hung and beheaded and murdered around, right? The greatest persecution the church ever faced in Rome, right? Those were seen, even by the pagans, as times of revival, of reformation, because they'd had a string of bad emperors, or they'd had, 4 or 5 emperors in 2-3 years, and this one gets murdered, and this one gets assassinated, and this one does blah, 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 and then someone comes in to restore the empire, right? Like Decius or like Diocletian, etc., etc. So it was already declining from 181. 300 years of decline and fade as Rome was fading in the West, off the world stage. Right? The view of these collapses and falls has to be much longer, which is why you hear me harp on about the Enlightenment so often. Right? Not because every single last thing in the Enlightenment was bad, but simply because the seed of it was, as was the majority of the fruit that it bore. Right? And that, we're talking the same time period, 300 years ago. And so you compare Rome from the beginnings of its decline with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 181 to its eventual collapse 300 years later, come to our timeline, and we are right around the exact same period, 300 years on, from this seminal change in the cultural, intellectual, religious landscape of European peoples, of which we're obviously descended as Australians. Right? It's the same time frame. And so the reason why you're seeing almost identical factors in our time, as compares to this time of the fall of Rome, is because it's the same time frame, roughly 300 years or so, plus or minus. Right? That third and final quotation that I give you there is a sign of, and he's not the only one who mentions this, there's others who mention this as well. But in reference again, because we're still talking about the Visigothic sack of Rome, the first sack of Rome, in 410. He mentions a mercy that God gives to the Christians in Rome. St. Augustine, again, keep in mind, who lived through this contemporaneously, explained that, quote, all who fled to the basilicas of the apostles, right, the churches, including old St. Peter's Cathedral, old St. Peter's Basilica. We're familiar with new St. Peter's Basilica, the one that's in the Vatican today, which was built right around the time of the Reformation, right, 500 years ago. It was built on top of old St. Peter's Basilica, hence the name, right? That was built during the days of Constantine, 326 for the groundbreaking. I think it was completed in 336 roughly. Anyway, early 4th century. That's what existed there, old St. Peter's Basilica, right? So that's what he's referring to, the great churches and basilicas of Rome. All who fled to the basilicas of the apostles were spared, not for their own sake, but out of reverence for the name of Christ. So when the Visigoths, as Arians, came through, they did not touch the churches, right? Even though they were heretics, it was still a Christian heresy that they adhered to. So they actually spared the churches. So people in Rome, including even pagans, who fled to the churches, lived, right? That was a mercy and a protection in that time from God, quite clearly, okay? One, however, that is also kind of repeated, right? So give us the next one. In the next one for me, yep. So from actually a student or a disciple of St. Augustine of Hippo, namely St. Paulus Orosius, he explains in History Against the Pagans, Book 7, which he writes, again, a couple of years after 418 AD, quote, the Goths, referring to the Visigoths, gave orders that no one should be slain, that all who had taken refuge in the churches should be spared. Okay? And it's why he actually writes toward at one point in Book 7, which is the last of these 7 books of this work, History Against the Pagans, from Orosius, quote, Rome was shaken, though not destroyed. Okay? The reason why this is important, apart from the fact that it's a broader discourse on the 5th century and the fall of Rome in general, is it's actually tying into what we're about to see in regard to the sack of Rome in 455, where that last line, Rome was shaken though not destroyed, is definitely not true. You have the sack at the hands of the Visigoths in 410. That is a kind of battering ram, right? Rome was broken but not destroyed. If that's what 410 is at the hands of the Visigoths, then when God sends the Vandals in 455, that's the shattering. That's the if the Visigoths in 410 were the battering ram, the Vandals in 455 were the broom that swept everything out, right? But even amidst that, God does something very Old Testament, which again, as I said, is bringing judgment on even those whom he uses to bring judgment, right? Because we have from elsewhere, from St. Procopius of Caesarea Maritima, right, the one you're familiar with probably from the book of Acts, over in Judea. He writes about a century later, he's one of the great historians of this kind of late antiquity, early Middle Ages period, right? He's writing in the Wars of Justinian, which is Justinian the Great. We'll look at him in later lessons. But in Book 3, Chapter 2 of that work, which he writes kind of in and around that time a bit later on, he says that Alaric, who was the Visigothic king who sacked Rome, right, after sacking Rome did not live long after, right? Sorry, or pardon me, died not long after, right? What he's referring to is the fact that the sack of Rome in 410 was over and done in 3 days. Alaric then joins his fleet on the coast to then sail down, invade Sicily in the south, go through villages and towns, gather resources to then come back to Rome with. Well, his fleet gets destroyed in a storm. He and his household guard barely survive, and then on the return trip from Sicily back up to Rome, he gets sick and dies of fever. This is all basically like within a week of him having sacked Rome. Okay, so he dies like in not long after this, right? So there's judgment. He does a very similar thing God does to what he did to Nebuchadnezzar, right? Judgment upon those whom he uses to bring judgment, right? Why is this important? Because it's stringing together these two things and giving you a really important image of something which can be lost here. It's super duper important if we're thinking about these things. What can we learn from them? 410, the sack of Rome in 410, was one last chance of repentance for the Roman people, as far as I and other kind of church historians would be concerned. Because like we saw in that quotation again, to remind you from St. Paulus Orosius, Rome was shaken though not destroyed, right? Rome didn't get burnt to the ground. The churches were all still intact, right? Plenty of people survived, especially those who took refuge in the churches, okay? So there's clearly protection from God here at the hands of the Visigoths, right? It's like one last final warning. Change or face destruction, right? Well, none of this improves in any meaningful capacity. Certainly, at least not as far as St. Augustine was concerned, as he writes on later on toward the end of his life in 430. None of this changes. There's no mass repentance among the Roman people. There's no changing of ways. The same sins, the same vices, the same degeneracy and corruption continues. And so then, of course, we eventually then get to the sack of Rome in 455, the Vandal sack of Rome. I explained in last week's lesson when we were talking about the various different migratory groups among the Germanics. The Vandals is actually where we get the English word vandalism from, okay, which gives you an idea of their style of going about things. Utter destruction and carnage was the modus operandi for the Vandals, okay, who also, like the Visigoths, were Arian heretics, okay? And so the Vandals come in 455. This is a famous painting from 19th century painting, Karl Brylov, Gaiseric sacking Rome at the hands of the barbarians. There's a typo there, but anyway. Gaiseric sacking Rome. And what we have in that time is, again, as the previous word said, Rome was shaken but not destroyed. Rome was shaken and very much destroyed. Okay? The Vandals come through, storm through the city, burn countless buildings to the ground. In fact, many of the Roman ruins which you can actually go and see today were actually made ruinous during the Vandal sack of Rome. Not all, obviously, but a number of key ones. Mass slaughter, the likes of which Rome had literally never seen in its history. It hadn't seen it during the Gallic sacking in 490 BC, which we referenced last week. They didn't see it in 410 at the hands of the Visigoths. Nothing had ever been done to Rome, the city proper, Rome proper, like this ever before. Absolute mass death and carnage, and you can see, especially if you look on your notes there for the image, you can see Gaiseric, the Vandal king there, with his plumed helmet upon his war horse. You can see many of his troops and mercenaries as well that he had with him, abducting and kidnapping the women. You can see treasures and various other things taken off. The Jewish temple, or the Jewish synagogue there, I should say, destroyed. And you can see one figure on the right of that painting, which is on page 3 of your notes and on screen for you now, in white and gold, if you can see near the pillar on the right. Right? And you'll see him, of course, wearing a cope, in other words, a cape, wearing, of course, the hat as well. This is the Bishop of Rome. This is the Bishop of Rome at the time, Pope Leo the Great, Pope Leo I. One of the truly great bishops of Rome, right? I'm saying that, one of the truly great bishops of Rome. A hero of the Roman Church during this time, who, again, like I mentioned earlier, thankfully part of this generation of church leaders who had come into the world and been raised at this fortuitous time, albeit calamitous, to guide and to protect through, because if Leo I was not Bishop of Rome at that time, then everything that happened with Rome would have probably been worse by a factor of multiples, like 3, 5, 10, I would suspect. He writes a lot during this time. He's famous for many things, of course. He was involved in the Council of Chalcedon in 451. We studied that in the early church history portion, right? The famous tome of Saint Pope Leo the Great was one of the most fundamental writings of this time in history, in Roman history especially, right? But to give you a quotation there underneath that image, this comes from Sermon 84, literally the same year. This is all of like a couple of weeks, or I think a bit over a month or two after this event, right? After the sack of Rome, which he, of course, literally lives through, right? Quote, "Where are the riches that once dazzled the nations? Where the honours? Where the security?" Of course, nowhere to be found. "The city has been stripped of its adornment. Its people have been led away captive. The dignity of Rome has been humbled." Right? Very much in the spirit of Saint Salvian, right? Because what the Vandals did was anyone that they did not kill was enslaved and taken off, right, and sold all around the world, right, including Christians. Right? So Christians were not spared this time during the sack of Rome in 455. Countless Christians were killed, martyred. Countless Christians were enslaved and sold to far-flung lands. Very few among the Church of Rome, at least proportionally speaking, obviously, survived. Right? As the leader of the Roman Church, obviously he survives. Because in a general sense, especially among Germanic peoples, kings don't kill kings, right? That would just be a general rule for most people. Kings, it's undignified for a king to kill a king, and the Vandals certainly viewed Leo as a kind of king, not in the literal sense, but as a kind of king, a kingly-like figure, a leader of a church, right? And so he survives this, right? And it's not like the entire church was wiped out, because again, it wasn't. The Church of Rome still survives, okay? Even amidst all of this great calamity and destruction. But perhaps one of the most pertinent and greatest of these, and I've got it on screen for you on this next slide, right? From Saint Sidonius Apollinaris, okay? Writing a number of decades later, right, about 15 years later, right? This one I don't have on your notes, but I have it here before you on screen. "Rome survived the Goths. She did not escape the Vandals." This is the essence of what I was talking about. That's from Letter 7, Section 7 of Letter 7, that he wrote in 470 AD. Right? Rome survived the Goths. She did not escape the Vandals. Rome, the Roman people, were given one last chance, right? One last chance to turn and repent. They didn't, and they faced destruction. Right? That's why it's barely 20 years after 455 and the waste that had been laid to Rome, right? That then the Ostrogoths, the third and final of these major Germanic tribes, crosses the Adriatic through northern Italy, conquers their way down, and finds such a weak husk of a city left under a man who very ironically, almost in a kind of quasi-prophetic way, was named Romulus Augustulus. So Augustulus, the same name that Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, bore, and Romulus, named after Romulus, who founded the city of Rome. So the last emperor of Rome, a meaningless, pathetic man, not to be too rude to him, but who just simply the Ostrogoths rolled in and went and took over Rome, right, was named after the city of Rome's founder, its first king, and its first emperor, by historical coincidence. It's very odd, but anyway, Romulus Augustus. And so that ends the empire, ultimately and effectively. Now again, it wasn't without heroes, and I don't want to leave it with the empire falls and doom and gloom and therefore it's the end of the world in history. Right? I actually want to leave you with two of the major heroes from that time. Right? Fortunately, during this time, in the wake of the sack of Rome in 455, so the Vandal sack, right, the second sack, What happens is the Vandals then establish a new Roman emperor. They don't become the Roman emperors themselves. They put in a puppet that they control. Okay. Within 5 minutes, it leads to civil war. Okay, because this emperor is clearly nothing but a puppet emperor for the Vandals, and everyone knows it. Two great Roman generals at this time, both Christian men, arise. The predominant one of which is Majorian. Okay, as we call him in English, Magorian, Majorian, right? Where we get the English word major from, right? The largest, the biggest, right? A great Roman general, and the one who's often sometimes called the last true emperor of the West. Okay, he is the last of the great Christian emperors. He is a general. He is very much like the great Romans of old, except in this case as a Christian man. He successfully overthrows the puppet emperor. He is appointed almost unanimously by his people and by the Senate as emperor. He brings restoration. He reconquers some of the territories that the Germanic tribes had taken, especially up in Gaul and Hispania. He brings legal reform, economic reform, religious reform, right? There's actually a kind of, what we might loosely say is like a revival in modern terms during his day. It doesn't last, but it certainly did for his time period, right? God gives, undeservedly, a great Christian emperor, paired with an equally great leader of the church in Rome, namely Leo the Great, Leo the First. Okay, that's a coin there, or it's effectively a drawing of a coin from that time period with Majorian, right? So in Latin, DN, that would have to be Deus, also Dominus Noster, our Lord Julius Majorianus, right? Julius Majorian, his name. PE would have to be something like Pius Felix, so the pious and the fortunate Augustus, AUG, right? So our Lord Julius Majorianus, right? Our Lord Julius Majorian, they're using the term Lord in like not the divine sense, but like, my Lord, like in terms of ancient terminology. The pious and fortunate Augustus or emperor, right? He became emperor in 456 in the aftermath of the Second and the Civil War that followed. But the other of the two was the one we were already introduced to before, which was Pope Leo the Great. Okay, this is the very famous painting from Raphael. He painted it between 413 to 414, of course, during the tail end of the Renaissance. In his particular case, this is the famous painting, which you will have for you, I believe, on page 4, yes. The Meeting of Leo the Great and Attila by Raphael. In and amidst the Visigothic and Vandal sackings was the only force and enemy even more terrifying than probably the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals put together, which we alluded to last week, and that was the Huns. Right, the Hunnic peoples, led of course by their most famous king Attila the Hun, as he's known. Right, they were from far-flung lands on the Eurasian steppe, horse lords from the heartland of the world island of Eurasia. They had come from these lands hitherto unknown. They had invaded through Eastern Europe, driven the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths back. So the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, these Germanic tribes were more afraid of them than anyone else, than even the Romans. They invaded various places, including Gaul, so France, etc., etc. They came all the way down into northern Italy and posed a threat to Rome just as the Visigoths and the Vandals had. And of course, the Huns would have been the utter end of everything, because the Huns were more brutal, more warlike, more ruthless, and quite frankly, on the whole, more talented than even the Vandals or the Visigoths. Right? The Huns were only stopped by a coalition of, ironically, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, and the Romans at the battles of the Catalonian fields, very famously in the middle of the 5th century, where the Romans allied themselves with the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths against the Huns. Anyway, in this painting you can see so much going on. It's a very typical Renaissance painting. You can see Pope Leo the Great on the left side there, in the golden coat, the papal tiara on his head near the cross there with other pontifical church leaders, right? You can see, of course, the horses and the horsemen of the Huns on the right amidst all the people. You can see Attila himself in the centre with the white plume, so on and so forth. The images at the top, the two figures in the kind of top of the arch there, if you see them on the kind of top left corner, if you want to imagine that, is developed from a later legend which kind of comes about that Attila sees the apostles Peter and Paul, right? I'm not necessarily quick to discount such things, or not so readily to. It doesn't mean I just whole hog dive and go, oh well, that must have happened. But I'm not quick to discount them necessarily either. This image becomes very famous, of course, and it's building from the fact that what happens is, and this is of course even more simply illustrated in the next image as well. Yep, this is much later on, early 20th century, Pope Leo the Great versus Attila the Hun, where Attila, although painted here much more like a Mongol warlord, a bit different, bit at a later time period, is met in the outskirts of northern Italy by Pope Leo. They have a famous meeting, a famous encounter wherein, to one degree or another, essentially, either through strong rhetoric or through begging, depending on who you asked, but either way, probably a mixture of both, essentially Pope Leo, as the only meaningful leader, because Majorian has not yet come to the throne, to the Imperium yet, right? This is a couple of years beforehand, is really the only meaningful leader of any strength or courage or valour in Rome at this time, right? Even as the church leader. And he ultimately convinces Attila and the Huns to not invade Rome, and they turn away, right? And so Rome is spared, right? That did truly happen, right? What was seen in what was or was not seen in the sky is maybe a different matter of speculation. But what definitely did happen, without question, is the meeting and the confrontation between St. Leo the Great and Attila the Hun. And this second image, which we have before you on screen as well as on the bottom of page 4, is quite impressive and telling, much as was the famous painting of Raphael. See, in this image, in this painting, the Huns are all entirely faced away. Their faces are not shown, right? Symbolising not being remembered, right? Whereas the only one whose face is seen, because even if you look around Leo the Great, there's Roman troops there, but all of them are wearing helmets. You can't actually see their face. The only one whose face you can see is Leo the Great, okay? Without sword in hand, he's not armed, right, because he wouldn't have been, right? All he has is his word and his faith and God's protection, right? And ultimately, and there, of course, they're standing, if you look in the bottom right corner of that painting, again, these paintings are usually so very deeply symbolic. What do you see in the bottom right corner? You see a broken, ruinous Corinthian column there, right? Decayed, right? And on the ground, so it's in the midst of this crumbling empire that God is still being gracious and compassionate, and these little lights at the end of the tunnel are still there. The light of Christianity, the light of the church, has not gone out, okay? And so that's why, again, it couldn't fit on these pages, but this is the fall of the Western Roman Empire, right? This is the famous work from the English-American, 19th century English-American painter Thomas Cole, very famous 4-part series of paintings, some of the best, quite frankly, of the modern era, on the cycle of empire, the cycle of empire, as it's more commonly known. The savage state, the beginnings, the Arcadian state, the culmination of empire, which is this other really beautiful painting of Rome, and then this is the fourth and final of them, which he painted in 1836. Okay, the destruction of empire. And that painting, you can see there this colossal statue, kind of almost reaching out in a defense, trying to hold back the destruction futilely. The clouds glooming over. You see barbarian dragon ships of the Germanic peoples in the bottom left corner. There, of course, you see buildings and marble, the great marble of Rome crumbling. You see fires breaking out. You see people running for their lives and people being abducted and so on and so forth. The destruction of empire. But off in the far distance, there is light breaking through the clouds. Right? Because the ultimate lesson to learn from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, right, or as I said earlier on, people just sometimes know as the fall of the Roman Empire, not really true because the Roman Empire still continues in the East, but the fall of the Western Roman Empire, is that it was brought about and precipitated by the sins of the people, including even the Christian people. That's what the Christian leaders of that day concluded from their time. They didn't blame this and that and everything else in between. They blamed us. Even if they themselves were not personally guilty, they were still part of the collective group, the nation, the people, the kin, the countrymen responsible. However, God still preserved his people, and the church, that is, through this time. The empire fell, but the church blossomed. Because what happened in the fall of the empire, at least in the West, is that Christianity spread farther and to greater degree, sometimes even by orders of magnitude more than it had ever done before, which seems completely counterintuitive. Because after all, it was, of course, the great Roman roads and the Roman naval domination of the Mediterranean and the eradication of piracy on the high seas, which had allowed Christianity to spread in the first place. Right, all those places you read about in the book of Acts where the Apostle Paul and his cohort are travelling to and fro is all on the Roman roads. Right? When they're travelling by sea, the only reason they're not getting done in by pirates is because there are no pirates anymore, because the Romans have killed them all and driven them off, and no one would dare be a pirate in the Mediterranean when the Roman Navy patrols it, and the Romans have conquered every single square inch of the Mediterranean coastline as they had done. Right? But it's ironically in the destruction of that entire system, the empire, its administration, I mean the Senate continues for about 100 more years and then again fades away like that, but the same roads which fell into ruin, the seas which became more dangerous than ever, it's actually amidst all of that that Christianity goes kaboom and explodes in numbers, right? So I said to you, it's like crushing a flower and the petals spreading everywhere, right? This is what happens through this destruction, and that's what we're going to then start to see throughout the rest of our time as we, of course, now, the next lesson, take our first meaningful step into what we definitively categorize as the early Middle Ages. Cool? Alrighty. Very good. Anyone have any questions or anything? Good-o. Alrighty. Next lesson, which will be lesson 40, obviously, we are going to move on to the first major figure of the early Middle Ages, which will be the Frankish king Clovis I, whom I'm sure you'll probably know nothing about, but you will come to learn about, because it is through him that God, not literally, but almost single-handedly saves Christianity in Western Europe. And more importantly, actually, really, through his wife. We'll get into that next lesson, all right? Thank you.